Diseases and Immunology trainee studying for my PhD at the University of Bristol. I'm going to summarise our work looking at pneumococcal transmission in families, generously supported through the ESPID Fellowship Scheme. I have no disclosures. Streptococcus pneumoniae forms part of the normal nasopharyngeal microbiome of young children and yet also causes more global morbidity and mortality than any other bacteria. Understanding transmission of pneumococcus is fundamental to curbing invasive pneumococcal disease. Young children are the main pneumococcal reservoir through nasopharyngeal carriage, and pneumococcal carriage density increases in the presence of respiratory viral infections such as influenza and rhinovirus. We know that density of microbial load influences transmission likelihood of many microbes, think HIV, TB, and possibly SARS-CoV-2. However, it is not known whether pneumococcal density in carriage impacts on transmission. Previously, the live attenuated influenza vaccine has been shown to increase pneumococcal density in mice and ferrets. There is also data that this is true in young children too. We therefore designed a randomised controlled stepwise study to investigate the impact of the live attenuated influenza vaccine on household pneumococcal transmission. Between 2017 and 2018, we enrolled 405 household families across 10 UK sites. Each family unit had to have a 2-year-old child eligible for the first LEIV as the index child, and at least 2 other household members, the contacts of the index child. All 1,556 participants were consented to provide 5 nasopharyngeal swabs, which were taken at 2-week intervals. Pneumococci were detected and quantified using LIT-A, quantitative PCR. Household family units were randomised at enrolment into either Group 1, where the index 2-year-old child would receive LEIV at day 0, or Group 2, who would be the control group until the 3rd visit at day 28, when the index child would also then receive LEIV. This study design would allow both longitudinal between Group 1 and 2 and horizontal between pre- and post-vaccination analysis of LEIV impact on pneumococcal density and transmission. All laboratory analysis was carried out by our group in Bristol, and data analysis was undertaken in R. In keeping with the literature, the plot on the left shows that carriage point prevalence was markedly different between the ages, with near 70% pneumococcal carriage in children under 5, 37% in children aged 5 to 18, and 10% in adults. We also found a marked difference in density of carriage by age, with young children carrying at much greater densities than older children and adults. But the range of density between and within individuals can vary by 6 orders of magnitude, from just a few, say 10, to over 2 million. Analysing the whole group, pre and 14 days following LEIV, index children who had received LEIV had a greater pneumococcal median density 14 days later than before. But this was not significant. Comparing the change in density in the index children receiving LEIV with the control index children of Group 2 between baseline and day 14 did, however, show a significant impact of LEIV. To see whether LEIV impacted transmission, we followed household contacts negative for pneumococcal carriage at baseline, whose index child was positive for pneumococcus at baseline, and we found a significantly higher proportion of Group 1 contacts had become pneumococcal carriers on day 14 when compared with control Group 2 contacts, as shown in this plot. Here, 43 of 230 in Group 1, that's 19%, and 21 of 209 in Group 2, that's 10%, became positive, and the difference between the groups was significant with a chi-square p-value of 0.015. This difference in contact point prevalence was no longer present at 28 days, where point prevalence was again equal between the groups. Randomization at baseline resulted in the two groups being otherwise similar for potentially confounding demographic factors such as age, working with young children, and household size. And so we conclude that this transient increase in pneumococcal carriage prevalence in contacts 14 days following index immunization with LEIV is most likely due to increased transmission from the index child as a result of LEIV administration. Retrospective analysis found a significantly higher pneumococcal density in the index children whose contacts became positive for pneumococcus compared with those that remained negative. We want to stress that the increased pneumococcal point prevalence in contacts of LEIV receiving index children was transient and did not result in an overall increase in carriage prevalence. LEIV reduces influenza risk and therefore potential complications of influenza, including secondary bacterial infection with pneumococcus. Also, circulating viral respiratory infections associated with much greater increases in pneumococcal carriage density than what we describe here secondary to LEIV. And this underlies the importance of vaccinating against influenza and the potential role of other respiratory viral immunizations in curbing pneumococcal transmission and disease. Our study limitations include lacking genomic data to prove transmission direction within our families. However, microarray analysis is ongoing, which should assist in reducing this limitation. I want to thank ESPID for their generosity in providing me with a salary to manage this study and analysing the data for my PhD, and for this opportunity to present our work. My sincere gratitude goes to all study participants, site's research staff, our funders, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Pfizer, and of course my supervisors, in particular Professor Adam Finn. Many thanks.
Good day, my name is Lily Verhagen. I work at the Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, and I also hold an appointment in Stellenbosch University, Cape Town, South Africa. And I'd really like to thank the ESPID board and the ESPID Committee for Scientific Affairs and Awards for providing me with the ESPID Fellowship Awards that made this work possible. Respiratory tract infections in children. Despite the identification of blood biomarkers that will in the future better be able to predict whether we deal with a viral or a bacterial respiratory tract infection, we are not quite there yet. And also, blood draws are usually only possible in hospital settings, which is not where most of the children with a respiratory tract infection present. My project is about zooming in on the respiratory mucosal level to see whether we can use mucosal sampling that is non-invasive, such as saliva, for more informative measurements that can help us to appropriately assess with which infection we are dealing and how we should be treating it. Now, this is the outline of the next 5 minutes of my talk. I'm going to talk a bit more about me and show you how mucosal antibody measurements may better be able to discriminate with what infection we are dealing and what the clinical outcome is. So my career has really evolved around respiratory tract infections. And over the past year, I've lived and worked in several places where I took samples, mucosal samples, mostly saliva, but also other mucosal samples from children presenting with acute or chronic respiratory tract infections. Currently, I'm based in Venezuela, the Caribbean, and that is unfortunately the reason I cannot be with you today. Now let's move to the project of my ESPID Fellowship Awards. And for this project, I made use of data from a cohort of children that was included between 2016 and 2019 in 2 Dutch hospitals. And from these children presenting with recurrent respiratory tract infections, we took samples, saliva samples and serum samples to measure antibodies against 3 different viruses. Influenza, which was the main theme of this project, but also RSV and SARS-CoV-2. Now, it's important to note here that the sample collection took place before the pandemic started. Yet we did measure antibody binding against SARS-CoV-2, so none of these children had been exposed to this virus. Now, moving over to the results, in this slide, I will show you that the mucosal antibody levels were highly correlated. And what do I mean with that? Here, what you see on the x-axis is saliva IgA levels against SARS-CoV-2 that none of the children had been exposed to. And on the y-axis, you see saliva IgA levels against influenza. Now, what you can see here is that there's a very strong correlation between the two. So the response or the antibody levels against one virus apparently are very similar to the response against another virus. So this suggests that we are measuring the same response. In other words, we are probably measuring here a consistent pool of polyreactive antibodies binding to different viruses, even viruses that the system had not encountered before in the saliva. Now, the next question obviously is, how is this for serum? And here you can see the difference. Each blue dot here depicts a statistically significant correlation. And you can see for saliva that there's statistically significant correlations between each of these antibody level responses for all the different viruses. Whereas for serum, you hardly see any correlations. And with additional measurements, we were able to assess that this polyreactive antibody pool in saliva is about 25% of the total antibodies, whereas this is only 2% for serum. So a very significant result. What do we get from this? What do we conclude from this? That if we compare the two systems, the respiratory tract with the systemic immune system, we find this pool of polyreactive antibodies responding against different viruses or binding to different viruses in the respiratory tract that is not there in the systemic tract in serum. Now, and it's logical if you think about the function of these antibodies. So the respiratory tract is continuously exposed to potential pathogens. So its function is to just block any pathogen that comes in, even if the body hasn't seen that before. Where there's that one pathogen that then invades the mucosal barrier and manages to potentially cause an invasive infection, that's the one that you get a targeted systemic immune response to. Now, finally, I'm going to show you two results of how these antibody measurements are related to clinical outcome. First, we saw that the higher levels of polyreactive saliva IgA were linked to less viral detection during the course of the winter season in these children. And secondly, we saw that higher levels of saliva polyreactive IgA and IgG were linked to less episodes of recurrent pneumonia in these children. And that is important because these recurrent pneumonia episodes are mostly related to morbidity and mortality. Now, zooming out, what can we learn from this? I think that when we zoom in on the respiratory mucosa, we can really see how we can use these non-invasive samples to understand and therefore appropriately treat respiratory tract infections in children. Now, thank you very much for your attention. Thanks again to ESPID for providing me with the fellowship awards, and really thanks to all the great people and teams that I've worked with over the past years, which is in the end what makes this work so enjoyable.